Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to be talking about workshop facilitation and how to make this more engaging for your audiences. My name's Hannah Lacey. I'm a public engagement and science communication professional, and today I'm joined by Bentley Crudgington, who's joining us to talk about the Ritual of Care workshop that they've run. Bentley, welcome and thanks for joining us.
No problem. Thank you for having me, Hannah.
So talk us through, this Ritual of Slow Care workshop, which you've run, is something that's quite different to any workshop that I've ever attended, in the way that it's run and the way you engage with people. Could you just give us a really brief overview about what the workshop is and the kind of experience you want people to get when attending?
Sure. So it's a slightly convoluted story in that we have to go back a little bit. This is based on or built on work that I was working on for the Animal Research Nexus. So this is a large interdisciplinary project that's looking at the societal kind of ethics and obligations and social contract around using animals in research. And it's a social science and humanities collaborative award from the Wellcome Trust. And one of this research streams from that, which is based at Southampton, is looking at the material and markets that are created in animal research. So the material objects and things that are created to allow animal research to happen, and also the animals themselves as materials that are kind of traded and economies are built around, and then how they are moved and create these economies. And as part of that work, we wanted to look at where people or how people imagined the research animal, where they came from and where they kind of traveled to. So this was with Emma Rowe and Sarah Perez and Paul Hurley, and we developed the Mouse Exchange as a workshop, which involved us setting up a table somewhere that was sort of visible, that people would come across, and asking them if they wanted to sit down and make a mouse with us. They would craft a mouse out of felt material, and as they did so, we would have a conversation with them about where they thought, or if they had ever thought about, where research animals came from, and who looked after them and kind of what happened to them. So it was a curiosity-driven workshop. And we wanted to use the materiality of having them create a mouse and thinking about a mouse and the different stages of that as a prompt for us to sort of start conversations with. And so we had run that for a while, and then I wanted to extend that and do some work that and ask some questions and take it further that we hadn't done in kind of family settings, and also connect this work of caring for research and with research, and how that connects to the public engagement. So I sort of made the Slow Ritual of Care, which you were part of. So that was presented at Engage 2020. And it was essentially two interlinked workshops. So people signed up, like yourself, and I sent you a activity pack that we opened in the first workshop, and that had some booklets in it for you to complete, and all the material you need to make a mouse. And we sat together in that space and we made those mice, and then we had conversations about, had you ever thought about where research mice came from and who cared for them and what their responsibility of care is like, and how care is kind of situated and embodied and constructed in kind of these situations, and we let those conversations sort of go where they wanted to. And then I was really interested to see what would happen when you switch roles from making a mouse to caring for a mouse. So you posted your mouse to the next person, and then everyone swapped a mouse, and then you lived with and cared for them based on the instructions that they sent with you, a mouse that someone else had created. And then in the second workshop, we explored those changing perceptions of how it felt to move from a creator to a carer, and what responsibility you felt to the mouse that you had created that you now didn't have versus the mouse that you were caring for that was in front of you. And in the first workshop, I asked you to make a wish and roll it up on a little piece of paper, and that was stitched inside the mouse. So this is where the kind of ritual element came into it. And in the second workshop, I gave you an offering to say. You then had the power to make someone's wish come true, but to do so, you had to read their wish out loud, which involved unmaking the mouse to retrieve that, to read it out loud. And we had a conversation of what that means to sort of would end a life or destroy something in order for something else to happen, and who would give permission of that, who ultimately could say yes or no, and how you felt about that, and how also that connects into public engagement. Now, we don't do a lot of destroying and euthanasia in public engagement, but we do make decisions about when projects come to an end, when stuff that is created is kind of taken apart. And we also make decisions when they get further away from people about where something is going to go and what it's going to lead to. And I was interested in how we related to those and explored those subjects, which I think we did in that second workshop.
Yeah, definitely. I actually do have sits in front of my desk, the little mouse from the session. So he still sits there, he's on my desk. And I think as a participant in something like that, it is a very interesting process to go through, especially with it being such an uncomfortable conversation. It's not something that, you might sit down and discuss over a drink down the pub back in the days when you could, with your friends. So I think it's really interesting, and the different elements that you have such in the workshop, such as the pacing, and when you sort of leaving time for people to answer questions. I personally found those to be very actually sort of thought-provoking, really interesting moments. I think sometimes we can have a tendency, if we're running a workshop, just boom, I've got this time, I need to fill it, I need to jam it full of content and engagement. So actually you sort of come out the other end being like, oh gosh, I feel like I've run a marathon. But yours doesn't do that. The pacing's quite different. And I think that has an impact on the audience members who engage. And what do you think are the core elements that you have throughout the Ritual of Care workshop 1 and 2 that you think are the sort of key ones that have enabled the reflection to take place?
It was very deliberate. It was planned on. So all of my stuff is sort of based on reflective practice. So it is about creating a space to reflect, but also reflection isn't a passive thing. So it's creating a framework and sort of guide to reflecting on these things. I think how I viewed it and why I was interested in the ritual, the word ritual has a kind of connotation of something that is slow and something that is performed, and there is a kind of reverence to it, and that's what I wanted to kind of play with. I also wanted, and it's something I try and sort of have in all of my workshops, is think of it as a gift to the people, especially at the end of the year and coming up to that conference. Everyone was so busy and everyone had spent so much time online, and I think at the beginning of the year, when people are working out how to take stuff online and how to continue working, and there was various successes in that, but I think by December there was this real rush of like, we have to make up for that time and be ultra productive. And you're right, and I still go to a lot of these meetings or a lot of these workshops there's so much pressure to be productive in them, and that's something that I wanted to actively resist. And so I think it is one of your, it's a question that you had posed to me before, which is about silence. And there's sort of two elements to that. One is I worked recently on another interdisciplinary project, and I worked with someone called Jackie Woolcock, who's a sonic anthropologist, and I had never heard or kind of considered sonic anthropology before, and even in the kind of theatre work that I'd done, I'd thought about what sound kind of feels like in that space, but never really thought about it as a discipline and a tool online. And I think when I started online, what I missed was people being able to talk over each other. And I think it does, the silence online, it feels so very different, and it feels like nothing is happening. And I think people, especially some facilitators and moderators, feel they need to fill that silence. But what's happening is people are thinking. So normally if you were in a room together, there would be some different sounds around, and it wouldn't feel as silent as no one speaking online does. And it's those moments of privacy when you're having a thought, and then you're also deciding how and what you want to make public and speak public. And if you rush people and rush past that, people either can't finish that and can't make that decision, and can you sometimes overshare, which makes them kind of vulnerable, and then they try to retract it, or they can't, you're onto something new, so that thought gets left behind. So I do sometimes have to write myself notes, or just say I'm going to give like a minute for that just to sit without saying anything. And it does take practice, again, because it kind of goes against everything, because you think, oh, people aren't speaking, they're not enjoying it. But that's not, that need is for me, and I wanted it to be about what the participants needed.
Yeah, I feel it's definitely something with silence, is when you're in maybe in a physical workshop face to face, you know, if there is a silence, you just think, oh, you know, people are having their coffee, or they're making notes, or probably checking their emails or something. But actually in this kind of setting, you are almost on, well, you are on screen, but almost in like a performance way. You
Mhm.
are sort of a subject that's, people are watching, and people can see you're not doing that. So actually it feels quite awkward. You're like, oh, I need to feel it. It's a very British thing, I think. People are like, oh, we need to make small talk about the weather. So it's interesting that actually the use of that, and thinking of it in the other side of things, you know, the idea that people can sit and sort of chew the fat, so to speak, on what they've just engaged with. Do you think that actually that's a really powerful tool that isn't used as much as it should be when it comes to communicating scientific research?
Yeah, well, I don't know if given people time to think, for me, there's a difference between what people kind of know and what people feel. And I think a lot of science communication is based on the objective side. So one of the things that I always come back to in creative facilitation, it comes from kind of the theory of participation, and it's from when I trained with the ICA. It's one of their tools, which would be called a focus conversation. So it's how do you lead someone through a conversation that may on an item that maybe they feel they don't have anything to say, or they feel they can't say anything on. So it was developed to help people have conversations about art, because art, I think, is like science, where people have an imagination of what a conversation about art is going to be like, and that they have to get the art, and there's all of these sort of kind of academic or sort of high culture things that they need to be able to articulate and say. You know, and that's not the case, or shouldn't be the case, for art and for science. So a focus conversation is broken down into 4 elements, and it's called the ORID. So you start by asking objective questions. So, you know, what happens? What do you know? What are the material facts? Or what, you know, what have you just done, or what have you just seen? And then you would move on to the reflective questions. So like, how does that feel, or how did that make you feel, or what, what did that sort of bring up in you? And then you would move into an interpretive stage, which was what else does that connect to, and where else have you seen this before, or what other kind of connections, or is it making you think now, where is this leading you to? And then you have the decisional, which is kind of like, what would you like to do about that, or where, you know, where should we do, what are we going to do with that now? So that's sort of the structure that I use at how we're asking questions, to move from an objective fact that someone can say anything about. So you could just say, there is a yellow background. And from then we can move on to have a much more in-depth conversation. That's the structure I use in Slow Ritual of Care. It's, if you kind of go back, I hope you've, you know, in your own time completed the rights booklet. But if you go back now and look at those questions, that's how they are structured, in that leading from what happened to how you felt to where you want to go with that information. And I think with a lot of science communication, we stick on the O with the objective, and then we concentrate on correcting people's objective opinion of something. And so I don't think we allow a lot of reflection about how they feel, or where they see it, or where it sits, like in their life and their community. So that much longer cycle of having a conversation, rather than concentrating on resolving something and correcting something, I think is where I get frustrated when I see a lot of psychon work.
And I think, so for me, I sit very much with the environmental science side of communicating research and engaging the public. And obviously there is a lot of the hard sciences that go into that, but actually when it comes to things like climate change, there's also a huge social impact, and it, you know, a lot of science communication is done about the empathy, and kind of, you know, there is an emotional connection to this. As humans, we have an emotional connection with nature, and, you know, living in, you know, times such as COVID, a lot of people are using that relationship with the environment and really helping them to continue in a somewhat normal life. I think one of the things that I personally would be worried about when engaging something like this is, because you are working with people and their emotions, it suddenly can become quite very, very personal, or very, very triggering potentially for somebody very quickly. And I think, you know, how do you get around that when it comes to, you know, working with people ethically, and how to support them when it can be quite an upsetting or difficult conversation?
Yeah, absolutely, and it is a balance. Obviously, you do need to. It sounds really reductive, but you need to allow space for emotions. So particularly, and I think there are, you know, levels and kind of layers to this as well. So I wanted to have emotional conversations, and I wanted to have nuanced kind of conversations, and that is always going to come from a personal perspective and a personal kind of feelings. And, you know, and allow for that, and show that we were allowing space for that. It's not there is a duty of care, but if you're having bringing up kind of emoting person, you don't necessarily have to deal with those. It's not a therapy session. It can be cathartic, but to say that they are welcome in that space, and to allow space to kind of go through them, and to show that there isn't a right or wrong response to that. There isn't a right or wrong way to feel, and that your feelings can change throughout the stuff, and you're welcome to show that. Generally, it is okay. People can be triggered, but that's not necessarily a bad thing in itself if it leads to it. What happens is if you build a really rigid structure around those conversations, and again with this productivity, if you're kind of like, well, I have to wrap this up now because I need to get onto this next bit and next bit, when you're sort of pushing those together, you're building pressure up with people. So you do have to accept that when you're having these conversations, they may just take a lot longer. if you're having these spaces in there. But you're going to decide on kind of where you want to have those, and how much in depth you want to go into those feelings or something.
So do you think just a sort of a practical way to possibly enable that is when you're planning out such workshops, you really think actually that could spark some really interesting or emotive conversations, and a very practical way of looking at it, maybe scheduling an extra 10 minutes for people to reflect, even if you don't end up needing that time, then that's fine, but actually do you think that's a practical way to embed that and facilitate that space?
I think it's avoiding putting a value judgment on people's feelings. So you can't be like, that's good or that's bad, or we have to make you feel better. Again, it's resisting resolving this thing, because you can have a really productive conversation, and this has come up in the work that I've been doing with the Animal Research Nexus. I've had conversations with people who feel incredibly strongly, either one way or another, about animal research, but I've never been interested in swaying their mind. I'm interested in having a really nuanced kind of conversation with them. So resisting changing or kind of influencing them in that sense and creating that space, yeah, you don't get as much pressure. Practical things you can do is kind of leave time, think about the invitation that you're making. If in the invitation you're talking about, I want to know how you feel or what this stirs up in you, then you need to accept and be prepared that that is what you will be working through. And if you don't want to do that, then change what you want, how you're inviting something. Obviously, no one just materializes in front like of a decision or into the, they bring everything with them, their experiences that day, how they were raised, how they talk to their friends, conversations they've had before, what they have just seen on the telly, what's in the news. All of those things influence about how people are kind of feeling about something. Practically, you can, we do talk about safe spaces, I think sometimes in quite a banal way without understanding of what those are. You can make a separate breakout room that's kind of always there, so people can step out and leave that. You can say people can leave and walk away from their screen or take a break whenever they want to, and come back or not. And you can check in with people. If you're running a kind of bigger group, I would always recommend having a producer or a co-facilitator who is watching for something, because sometimes they will catch something that you don't miss, and you can message someone, just say it's okay, or you can follow up with them afterwards, saying, if you want to talk anything else through, or if there's anything else that I can help you with. But I would say only do that if you're prepared to then go through that conversation. But it's about planning what the purpose of your event and your intervention is at the beginning, and where that's going. So you should be planning way beyond your your event. So it's not as soon as, if you're running something from 2 till 3, your plan shouldn't stop at 3 o'clock. Like, it should be what's happened next, and plan time for what you want to do in that session. So give yourself half an hour to make some notes and some reflections at the end of that, revisit it in a week, follow up with someone, plan out an email, keep it in your drafts, all of that things. It shouldn't just, the event shouldn't start as soon as the timer starts and end as soon as the session is finished. It's about all of that space and considering it.
It's a really interesting way of looking at it, because I think we do get to a point when we go, okay, I've delivered that, I've done that engagement, tick. And although we, very strong emphasis on evaluation in projects, actually maybe it doesn't necessarily cover that element. And actually maybe there is a tool of good practice that people need to sort of start picking up and developing, with that idea of that sort of self-evaluation when you have been dealing with things like that. I like this idea of looking beyond the 3 o'clock. What happens at 4 o'clock, what happens 2 weeks down the line, etc. And I think that can be something that's quite valuable. I think when, especially in science communication and public engagement, there's an increase of talk on behaviour change, and that after you've engaged with someone, a member of the public, a public group, maybe you're trying to get them to change their behaviours. So maybe for slow ritual care, it's a behaviour change in being more supportive towards using animals in research, or thinking on the sort of climate change. For me, taking action, I don't know, use less single-use plastic. And do you think that, I don't know, a bit of horizon scanning here, do you think that actually in the future there's going to be more of this reflection that needs to be coming into this and this type of facilitation to help with behaviour change?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say that has never been and isn't my aim to make people more supportive of animal research. I'm I'm happy if it goes either way, and we have that a lot. People say, I was really certain I knew a lot about it, and I knew what my rationale behind it was, and now I'm less certain, or now I feel like maybe I'm not supportive. And then other people will be like, I didn't know those processes were in place. I didn't know that. So I guess my aims would be opening stuff up. And again, I know I've said this a lot, but it's resisting resolving and packing everything back up at the end of the session. And also psychologically, for your participants. And when we're looking at evaluation, and I know it's a very complex system, because getting people to feedback or getting back in contact with people can be very difficult, because you then have to collect information that needs to be held and all of that, and getting them to respond to stuff later is hard. But if the second something finishes, or you finish with an evaluation form, then psychologically that makes people go, I finished thinking about this. I put that way. So talking about how you influence behaviors, or people taking that away with them, if you make them pack all of that up, and then write down what they're thinking right there and then, that can kind of condense that thinking and pack it back in. So yes, I'm not saying I have the answers to how you go about getting evaluation done later, but I think we look at evaluation really focusing back on productivity and proving that we have to do a lot in public engagement, that what we're doing is worthwhile. And we're doing that on metrics that I don't think necessarily work, and on timescales I don't think necessarily work. And this is going to, I think, negatively impact on, and you can see it is having a negative impact on public engagement, because now evaluation is having a lot more sort of critical assessment on it, and people are just saying, well, these are just numbers, or these statements are kind of meaningless, and this hasn't had an impact. And if you think about it logically, you're like, well, no, you can't necessarily track someone answering a question at the very end of something to how that's going to or has changed their behavior, which hasn't happened yet. So these much longer processes, which are much more difficult, much more expensive, much more kind of care is taken. But again, it all comes back to the relationship with your audience and what you should be offering something to them. Sometimes I know you will have done this as well. You go to a session, you just feel, I feel like I've been harvested. Like I feel like they wanted information from me. They wanted my thoughts. They wanted my feelings. They wanted my insights. It's like, do this poll, fill out this survey, answer this form, do this, do that, like recording this, or I'm going to record this, and we're going to record this and record this. And I'm like exhausted by the end of it, and go away thinking I didn't learn anything, I didn't kind of reflect on anything, and I don't think I want to do anything with those people again, because me being there benefited them. Me being with them didn't benefit me. And I think that's what we need to think about a lot more.
100%. It can definitely be in all types, not just public engagement, in all types of workshops. I think you can come out of it and being like, well, I've told them everything apart from, my date of birth, my mother's maiden name, and my favourite colour. You can feel very, very drained. And I think that's a trap that we can easily fall into when it comes to evaluation, because yes, we do have to prove what we're doing and why we're doing it and why we're spending money on it. But I wonder if actually there is maybe something there about, because of the nature of science research, and that it is evidence gathering, and it's getting the numbers, and it's getting the evidence of the impact, or the evidence that this chemical reaction has happened. Do you think maybe in some way, when science is involved in obviously science communication and public engagement, do you think maybe that we need to get more of a balance, or even step further away from that sort of scientific rigorous approach?
I wouldn't say you're stepping away from rigor, and I think this comes up a lot, and I think this is the contention, and I think why a lot of well, it's certainly one reason why a lot of science and arts kind of crossover or collaborations fail, because if you're seen as taking a more creative way of doing something, it's always creative, and it happens to me all the time. People are just like, oh, and this is the work the creatives have done, and it's like, that's a nice illustration, and it's seen as it isn't rigorous, and the thing is, like, it is. A lot of it, I've given you a few examples of kind of how I planned the workshop out, that is rigorous, and that there's theories attached to it, and the people who are working in creative facilitation and community work, all of them have their systems, and it is a rigorous system. I think what kind of can escape or is invisible is the kind of ethics of data gathering. Kind of in science, you're like, well, I'm just going to collect as much information as I can, especially kind of field work, when you're like, well, I might not be able to get back here, so I'm going to take this and this and this and this, and then I'm going to do this. And anyone who's worked in kind of any research will have data, no matter what it is, that they have never analyzed or never looked at, because when they got back, they were like, oh, actually, I don't need that. But in kind of evaluation of public engagement, I don't think we think like that. I think we'll like ask the generic questions and a few more questions, which is basically a dead end street of getting people to say what we want them to, and collect some other information. Like, people collect, age, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, all of these kind of stuff, and it's like, how does that have any relation to what you're doing? Are you going to is your research question related to how specific genders within different ethnicities think about this thing? If it's not, then why the hell are you asking for it again? And it's that, because there's no impact in me asking these questions and collecting this data on people, that it goes back to an individual, and it's being treated like an individual that I think sometimes is difficult for these kind of processes, or it doesn't necessarily come up in those processes. So yeah, again, but that's thinking about before the event and after that event. So even if it helps, do your little graph, like at the end, if you want to stick with that system, going, how am I going to analyze that data at the end that I'm gathering? What is that going to show me? And then think, well, am I asking the right question at the beginning then? Does asking that question get me to that, or allow me to examine that? And if it doesn't, then don't ask that question.
Yeah, I completely agree. I definitely think there's always scope and room for growth when it comes to running workshops and engaging with the public, and saying about working with the individual, and how it actually does come down to individual responses and working with that person, rather than a term that all us public engagement people dislike, is the public. There is no such thing as this big massive people that exist, because everyone is different and experiences life, and interacts with the science and the science research in different ways. It's been really interesting to hear from you, Bentley, about how this workshop works and functions, and the way you've designed it. And I'd be really keen to know, as kind of the parting last question, what would your top 3 things be, for someone who wanted to consider designing a facilitated workshop that draws on elements of these?
I mean, I think that the top one would be pay for a facilitator, and not just to deliver it, to help you build and run that session. So it's not something you just step into. Facilitators, there is this irritating thing that happens with facilitators, is that you're asked to come along and sprinkle a little bit of magic on it, which is like incredibly patronizing, because you can't get a result if the kind of building blocks kind of aren't there, or you can't run everything. You can make improvements. So if you're completely new to it, then take the time, get some training, the same as you wouldn't suddenly start using a new piece of equipment without either being trained on it or reading the manual or comparing it to something else. So think of it as exactly the same thing. So get someone in to help with you or get some training in it. Time, it will take a lot of time to develop it and probably run it. So, you know, allow yourself the time before the event and then kind of afterwards. And lastly is, you know, iterations. You'll probably never get it right first time. So you may have to run it with a few, you know, guests or friends or people like that to say, this is what I'm trying to do, and really do take the time to go through that and be, you know, practice self-reflection. Go, okay, did that go well? And ask people to be frank about it. You know, ask them if they were bored or what could have been better, and just admit that you won't get it right first time, and that it's always kind of a process that you will need to build on it.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us today. It's been great to learn about a slow ritual care workshop in more detail, and it's really given me some thoughts on how to continue running, start running, continue running workshops, and think about how actually you do engage with those individuals. And I think the science communication and public engagement with research has really got some exciting places that it can go, and learning from these. And I think hopefully we're going to get there with more projects becoming more interdisciplinary. So thank you so much for joining us, Bentley. It's been great to chat with you.
Thank you.
Okay.